Hey all, and welcome to my second video on making and completing a scenery diorama. My name is Luke, and this video will encompass everything you need to know in order to build and complete a scene just like the one you see here. The tips and techniques I show can be used in conjunction with each other to create a scene just like the one I'm about to demonstrate, or they can be used individually and incorporated into your own methods to build on your already proven techniques. With the introductions aside, let's get started. As with any diorama or model railroad scenery, we need to start with planning the landform. A common material used for building up landforms is extruded foam, so that's what I'll be using for the base. I'm planning out where I want my road, the mud puddle and the embankment, which will be my main features, by drawing in a rough outline. The outline will help me with visualizing the scene. One good property of using extruded foam is its ease of use. It's very easy to carve and shape using basic tools like a sharp knife and a wire brush. I've decided to use a piece of HO scale cork roadbed for the road. As this will be a dirt road, I'm not concerned about its width. As long as one car can fit, I'll be happy. I also want to remove the edge here, so I sand back the cork. And by cutting slits along one edge will help the cork flex around the corner. To glue the foam together, I'll use Gorilla Glue. It's good for adhering non-porous surfaces together. And to help get a good bond, I rough up the surface of the foam where I'll be gluing them together. As per the instructions, I lightly dampen the surface and apply the glue. Gorilla Glue expands, so be sure to weigh down the foam as the glue sets. For the cork roadbed, I'll just use wood glue, but I'll once again roughen the surface to improve the bond between the glue and the foam. And to get the super elevation I was after, I simply use small blocks of cork on one side. Then, when everything is in place, I weigh it all down so it dries in place. If you have any track pins or normal pins for that matter, you could use that to hold the cork in place. I didn't think of that until after I had already done it, but you live and learn. Plaster doesn't stick all that well to foam, so I really give the foam a good scraping with the wire brush, and then I prepare the sculptor mould. You want it to end up with the consistency of cottage cheese before applying it, and I also wet the foam down prior to applying the sculptor mould. Sculptor mould is quite easy to work with. Just push it around with your fingers and build up the terrain. Make sure to cover all the foam areas except the area where the dried up puddle will be going, and don't worry too much about covering the cork, as that will be covered soon with straight plaster of Paris. Keep rubbing the sculptor mould until it begins to set, and you can get a nice smooth finish. Now I start the same process with the road, however this time I'm using plaster of Paris, not sculptor mould. The road will need to be quite smooth, and once the plaster dries, I'll be giving it a light sand. I want to incorporate a small rock outcropping, so I used a Woodland Scenics rock mould, and once the moulds have dried, I test fit them in place. I use more plaster to fix them in place, however just be sure to thoroughly wet the area before applying the plaster to fix the rock outcroppings in place. Otherwise the plaster used to hold the rocks will not dry properly and will crumble away. Once the rocks are in place, I blend the wet plaster into the rocks and scenery. You have many options for colouring the rocks. The method I've decided to use is a very common technique called leopard spotting. Simply make a light acrylic wash using some raw umber mixed with water. I didn't measure it exactly, however I'm roughly using 1 part paint to about 30 parts water. I spot the first colour over about 60% of the rock, and I then come in with a black wash and cover the entire area, going over the first colour as well. Now the road has had time to dry, I come back in and lightly sand it to smooth it out. I'm ready to apply the base coat. Any light brown will generally do. It's going to be mostly covered with my dirt texture, however if there are any bare areas of dirt, this will prevent white plaster showing through. Make sure you don't paint over your rocks, but do your best to get in nice and close. I've planned to make a dried up puddle here, so I'm going to mask this area off before applying the dirt texture. Before I move on, I'll show you how to make the glue I used to fix the scenery in place. I use matte Mod Podge, which is similar to PVA wood glue, however it dries completely matte. I dilute 1 part Mod Podge with 3 parts water and also add in a few drops of liquid washing detergent. To apply the glue, I usually mist it on the scenery using a spray bottle. The finer the spray, the better. And for dense areas of scenery, I'll use an eyedropper to apply the glue. The dirt texture I use is a 50-50 mix of fine sandalwood grout mixed with fine sifted soil. I use an old spray can lid and stocking to make an applicator for the dirt. You could use a spoon or even your fingers to apply the dirt, however I find this way works best to get an even application. And it's necessary to get an even application of dirt over the road surface. Now I'm ready to apply the dirt. First, start by pasting the diluted Mod Podge glue over the entire area, but avoid getting any on the face of the rocks. When applying the dirt texture, do your best to get an even coat over everything, and you can even go directly over the rocks. The dirt will naturally fall into the crevices of the rock. Then remove the tape from the masked area where the dried up puddle will be, and spray the area with wet water or alcohol, and finally fix everything in place by misting the area with glue. Excess glue can be soaked up with a paper towel. Just be careful to avoid disturbing the dirt. Now the real transformation begins. Static grass. I use a mixture of grasses to get varying colours, textures and lengths. I'm mixing 4mm and 6mm grasses together. Be sure to mix them well. I place the grass in the static grass applicator ready to go. This is my homemade applicator for which I have a how-to video on. This time I use full strength Mod Podge and randomly apply it where I want static grass. Obviously not on the road or the puddle. Typically you would use a pin to attach the negative wire from the static grass applicator to the glue, but because I have many patches that are not connected, I'll use a wire and just touch it on each area of glue as I apply the grass. Then once all the glue has been covered, you can use a vacuum to remove the excess, or in my case, turn the diorama upside down. If you place a sock over the end of the vacuum, you'll be able to salvage the excess grass for later use. Or possibly use a small vacuum with a clean catcher, that way you can collect the remains from inside the vacuum. Whilst the glue is still wet, you can shape the grass fibres, but it's not always necessary. I paint the puddle with a dark brown to create some contrast for the cracks. Then once the base layer is dry, I can apply the crackle paint. I'm using a technical paint from Citadel called Agrelin Earth. To get the most from this paint, you need to liberally apply it over the area you want the cracked puddle to be. The thickness will determine the size of the cracks. Thicker will equal bigger cracks. To add fallen rocks below the rock face, I'll mix up some plaster, then apply a thin layer over some baking paper and let that dry. I can then break it into small pieces and shake them up in a container, which will smooth out the sharp sides and make nice round edges. I then sift it into different grades and colour the plaster with the same black acrylic wash I used to colour the rock face. Once dry, I take a small amount and sprinkle them below the rock to simulate fallen rocks. You can also buy commercial talus, however I decided to make my own so I could colour it to my liking. I use quite a variety of fine and coarse foam to build up the ground texture. Basically, I start low by applying the fine turf and gradually build up to applying coarse turf, bushes and finally trees. It's about blending, trying to tie everything together so it looks natural. I also use my fine sifted soil and grout to blend, as well as the Woodland Scenics products. The colour I use most is burnt grass from Woodland Scenics. I find it's a nice green with low contrast that does a good job of blending the other colours together. I make sure to add some fine turf down the centre of the road and brush away any excess that falls in the wheel tracks. I do the same with the fine buff ballast down the sides of the road and also down the centre of the road, again brushing away any of the excess that falls in the wheel tracks. Make sure to also brush away any scenic material from the cracked puddle and slowly build up the layers. Once you're done, fix those layers in place with the Mod Podge glue. Next, I use clump foliage for low-lying bushes and weeds, and I use Woodland Scenics fine leaf foliage for small trees. The static grass can help the fine leaf foliage stand up straight. The clump foliage looks a little flat, so I sprinkle some knock leaves over the top to give it some life and spread them out with a brush. The trees I'm using are the ones I made in a previous video, which you might like to check out. I simply test each tree in a spot that looks good, then use a hobby knife to bore a hole into the plaster and glue the tree in place. And the glue, by the way, is full strength Mod Podge. Depending on the tree, you may or may not need to prop something against it to keep it in place while the glue dries. To help blend the base of the trunk with the rest of the scenery, I lightly sprinkle some burnt grass foam around the base while the glue is still wet and lightly blow away the excess. Something you will usually see around the base of trees are broken dead branches. You can easily model this using small twigs. And another common sight around the base of trees are dead leaves and bark. To simulate these, I use actual dead leaves and bark. I'm using a cheap $10 blender. Blend it until it's about the consistency of fine ground foam. I then sift out the larger pieces and apply it to the base of the trees I've planted on the diorama. I lightly spray the glue once more to fix the leaves and fallen branches in place. To help sell the illusion of this being a dirt road, I'm going to add in some road markers around the corner. Nothing too fancy. I will, however, weather them using India ink and then dry brush some white over the top, giving a nice dull white. I'm trying to give the impression they've been there a while. I also paint a small red dot which is supposed to be a reflector, so at night a car can see the corner coming and not come crashing off the road. I fix them in place the same way I fix the trees in place. Now for the coolest part, weathering the road. I'm trying to give the impression this is an old, dusty road, so I'll lightly weather it with artist pastels. I'm only going to use raw sienna. You can basically use any colour you want, however I find raw sienna gives a good dusty road effect. Using a nice soft brush that is completely dry, I load it up with the pastel. Start light and gradually work more pastel into the road as you see fit, and feather it out towards the edges so it gradually blends into the darker dirt colour on the roadside. Now it's time to stand back and admire your work. This diorama only covers a very small area, however the techniques can be applied to any sized area and you will still get the same great effect of realism. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed the build. I try to post as many videos as I can, so if you want to stay up to date with my latest releases, please subscribe. I have plenty more videos and ideas on the way. In the meantime, feel free to check out my channel and see if there's any other videos there that you might like. Cheers and thanks for watching.